Okay, so I haven't really talked about Donald Trump or the election much since my pre-election videos, and I think it's time. So here's an essay that I wrote that combines some philosophy and history, thoughts on Trump's Gaza into the Riviera plan, his musings about buying Greenland, the negotiations on ending the war in Ukraine, and one of the most popular campaign slogans and flags of the Trump campaign that look like this: no more bullshit, Trump 2024, because I'm not the first to point out now that this simultaneously refreshing and dreadful moment that we're in which the honesty of Donald Trump, in quotes there, is revealing, or maybe I should say the Trumpian moment of the world for this conversation extends well beyond the American president. So let me explain. I'm calling this Dear Trumpers, We Have More in Common Than You Think, from a leftist. So, dear Trumpers, I want to make an appeal to you, not as a liberal, not as a Democrat, not as a conservative, and certainly not as a Republican, for I am none of those things, but as a leftist. And before I dive into my argument, I actually want to bring up something that I think illustrates where we really agree on the myth of the global political project and what it's really been all about. So remember when Donald Trump first got in office and suddenly announced, hey, I want Greenland. I want to buy Greenland. Give it to me. The U.S. is going to buy it. And the media and late night comedians had a field day calling him insane, laughing at the absurdity of it. And sure, it was bizarre in its presentation, as many things that Trump does was. But I actually think there's something worth thinking about there. Not about whether the U.S. should actually own Greenland or not, that's irrelevant, but about the reaction to the suggestion. Because what happened was Denmark responded with something like, Greenland is not for sale. And I hope I wasn't the only one thinking, wait a minute, Denmark? Why does Denmark have control over Greenland? Why do they have any more claim to it than the United States or Canada or Sweden, for that matter? What the hell is going on here? And Denmark's claim over Greenland is just another remnant of an old colonial past, one that obviously never really ended. So when the Kingdom of Denmark arrived there in Greenland in the 1700s, there were around 8,000 Inuit people known as the Kalaaleet, who had already been living there for thousands of years and thriving in the Arctic through hunting and fishing and communal survival. But as is the case with many colonial stories, theirs is one of Christianization and forced assimilation and enforcing the Danish language and systematically erasing their culture. One of the most infamous examples and attempts at this forced assimilation was known as the Little Danes experiment in the 1950s, where 22 Inuit children were taken from their families in Greenland and sent to Denmark to be raised as Danish citizens, forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their customs. Many suffered lifelong trauma, caught between the worlds where, they were never fully belonged in either place. Anyway, there's also a strange twist to this story that during World War II, when Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the United States simply took control of Greenland, kind of holding on to it like a library book until the war ended and then handing it back. That's all just kind of the quiet imperialism part that rarely makes it into the mainstream narrative. And Trump, in his crude way, probably recognized the absurdity of it all and just said the quiet part out loud of, why didn't we get to keep it for doing that favor? So anyway, while everyone was laughing at Donald Trump for saying the quiet part out loud, the real absurdity was staring us all in the face. The media and liberals mocked him endlessly for the idea of buying Greenland, but in doing so, they casually ignored the fact that Greenland is still locked in a colonial arrangement that nobody seems to question, maybe other than leftists. This is exactly the kind of thing I mean when I think that we have something to talk about and the masks are coming off and the bullshit is really fading away and the real naked reality of global politics is being exposed. And this little weird Greenland moment kind of foreshadows the bigger argument that I'm making here. Trump isn't an outlier. He's just the first person in a long while to say bluntly, maybe, what the game has always been about. And so this split in worldviews is really laid bare. The leftist, that's me, and Trump see world politics for what it is or what it has been. A giant game of risk, a realpolitik game of conquest and deal-making to see who comes out on top, a casino where you try to bluff, maneuver, outflank, and bet better than the other guys at the table and win. The only difference here, of course, is that Trump endorses that vision of things and wants to simply drop the pretense of having ever been about anything else. And I think that vision of things is dreadful, immoral, and aimed really at a world not worth winning in the first place. And of course, that's a huge difference, but at least we don't have to be hung up on the bullshit about liberating the world or delivering freedom to distant lands or any of that hypocritical nonsense which the rhinos and liberals were so fond of blathering on about. Okay, so let me get really into my argument here. So in large measure, we actually agree on a few really important starting points to have a conversation. To quickly gesture at a few of these common things, the global system, which has formed over the last century, the international alliances, trade arrangements, and especially the United States' imagined role as maybe the policeman or defender of the free world in all of it, the policies of American deindustrialization and globalization, which without much of a plan, other than maybe foreign trade deals and the rapid flow of money and influence to coastal cities and tech companies. And importantly also, the confusion and hysteria of many liberals who seem to think that all of this can be fixed or addressed by obsessing over identity representation in an already broken system. So we agree that none of that is really working, nor has much of any of it been honest or ethical. So let me point at what I think is the underlying philosophy that has given rise to so many of those problems. It's called neoliberalism. And it's not just an economic system, it's a worldview, a totalizing logic that insists everything can be understood and valued through the lens of market rationality. It extends beyond Wall Street and libertarian finance, and it bleeds into every aspect of life: dating, education, morality, even personal identity. Everything gets reduced to a transaction, a marketplace where individuals are expected to collect forms of capital, whether it be money or social status and likes or credentials or influence, and then you exchange those for personal gain. Neoliberalism preaches that the best outcomes arise from unregulated self-interest, from the invisible hand sorting things out. Government's only real role in this view is to keep the gears of the market running smoothly, to ensure capital flows efficiently. Even if that means crushing worker protections, dismantling public institutions, or privatizing what was once a common good, there's no higher moral vision in the system. There's no divinity in the market. The only sacred thing is the market itself. And we are told that the market, by some mysterious force, knows us better than we know ourselves. That whatever it produces must be a reflection of our truest desires. And that this picture is, in essence, freedom. So let's talk about freedom. This is a word that you Trumpers love, but it's not just you. It's a word that resonates with every human being. It's invoked endlessly, wielded to justify every philosophy, every political stance, every ideological position. But the problem is that freedom is not as simple as it's often made to seem. We all think we know what it means, but different people define it fundamentally different. And neoliberalism, the system that I think both you and I, as a leftist, agree has failed us or is inadequate, insists on a version of freedom that is not only incomplete, but dangerously flawed, maybe even fatally flawed. I think you Trumpers probably conceive of freedom as mainly the absence of government dictating to you what you or your children can think, learn, or buy. You want autonomy. You don't want to be inhibited by state directives, whether it's about wearing masks or school choice or how you run your business. And I, as a leftist, really do get that. Let me tell you that leftism has been profoundly misunderstood, slandered even, as maybe some philosophy obsessed with big government control and regulation. And that's not what leftism is. That's liberalism, big government liberalism, a separate thing entirely. And if you really trace the history, leftists have often been the fiercest critics of government overreach, state power, and unaccountable institutions. I mean, the difference is leftism is skeptical of all power structures, where I think you Trumpers and libertarianism is a bit focused on the government version of that. Many leftists, in fact, are anarchists, though that word has also been misunderstood and twisted a little bit beyond recognition. Anarchism isn't about chaos or destruction. It's about opposing entrenched hierarchies, concentrated power, and systems that exert control over people's lives, whether that power comes from the government, corporations, or unelected elites. It's inherently skeptical of power, all power. Leftism is anti-authoritarian in that way. Leftism is a form of radical self-determination. And in that sense, leftism isn't about bigger government. If anything, it's about bigger dignity, the ability to live in a way where you are not just free from coercion, government coercion, but free to build a meaningful life, to pursue dreams without being boxed in by forces that distort your choices before you even get to make them. Because here's the thing. Freedom isn't just the ability to do what you want or buy what you want. It's the ability to dream of what you want to be without being manipulated, constrained, or shaped by powers beyond your control. And not just by the government, but also by the unchecked, unjust, and powerful manipulation of your own vices. This is where neoliberalism's version of freedom collapses, because it assumes that markets enhance freedom rather than restrict it. That as long as you're not forced to do something, then you're free. That people making choices in the market are exercising their freedom. But are they really? Or are they, more often than not, being nudged, manipulated, and steered? Are markets actually delivering the kind of world we truly want? Or are they simply constructing worlds that we can't resist? And is there a difference? I think we all know that there is. Because real freedom isn't just about having options. It's about having the ability to reject entire versions of the world that are being forced upon us. It's about resisting the forces, corporate, political, psychological, that shape us into consumers rather than citizens, into participants rather than authors of our own lives. And we see this every day. We see this in the way social media is designed to addict us. We see it in predatory loan structures that trap people in cycles of debt. We see it in food engineered to override our instincts, in surveillance technology that strips away privacy while selling us convenience. And we see it in the growing realization that sometimes we are begging the market to not offer us something that we cannot resist. So when people talk about freedom, we need to ask freedom for what and freedom for whom? Because if we're not careful, the world we will get will not be the one that we truly want, but the one that was easiest for us to fall into, the one that we couldn't resist. But the point I want to make here about neoliberalism's conception of freedom and the inherent flaw in it lies, I think, in two concepts that really dominated political conversation in the 20th century and are now coming to a head in the 21st. That's self-interest and self-determination. Taken separately, each presents a somewhat compelling description or vision of freedom, but when they collide, the entire framework collapses under its own contradiction. So let me give a brief historical sketch of how these ideas have played out over the past century. So before World War I, the world looked a little like this. This is a really cool map if you zoom into it and see the relationships, but the world was basically shaped by overt colonialism. European empires were in a race to extract wealth from Africa, Asia, and beyond, and they would justify their dominance with language about civilizing missions, maybe religious duty, managerial responsibility. Of course, the people being managed might have felt differently. And meanwhile, the United States at that time, a nation populated by many people who had fled that European kind of madhouse, was hesitant to fully engage in these global structures and was more isolationist, at least at that time, at the turn of the century. But this imperialist world order was unsustainable. Empires were overextended, running up huge debts, clashing over resources all over the world. The writing was kind of on the wall, something really had to break. And when World War I erupted, It wasn't, of course, just about alliances or assassinations. It was about global positioning and control and the redistribution of power. And in the background, there were ideological battles that were taking shape about how nations should define themselves in the aftermath of the collapse of this world. Who would be allowed to chart their own futures? And in this cauldron is where nationalism as an idea really began to take hold, and of course also where Zionism tried to get its foot in the nationalist door as well. There was many. So self-determination became the rallying cry as the war ended. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, of course, championed this principle as the cornerstone of this new idea called the League of Nations. He argued that people should be able to define their own political and economic destinies, free from foreign control. This would be the principle, self-determination, that he was proposing would be the organizing principle of the new post-World War I world. It sounds, at face value, like something that you Trumpers might support. The idea, of course, was skeptical of intervention, resistant to external control, committed to national sovereignty. But in reality, the idea was really dead on arrival. So when colonial subjects from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia showed up to these post-war meetings at the League of Nations, eager to embrace this principle, they quickly learned that self-determination really wasn't meant for them. The European powers, fresh off the battlefield, had no intention of relinquishing their control over the wealth and resources of the global South. They simply maybe rebranded their empires under new terms. So spheres of influence instead of colonies, and mandates instead of occupations. The British and the French had already carved up the Middle East, it turns out. The Belgians clung to the Congo, the Dutch held on to Indonesia, the Danish to Greenland. Self-determination, it turned out, only really was applying to European nations, not the colonized world. And so the League of Nations failed. War returned, more vicious than before. And when World War II ended, the United States finally emerged as a dominant world power, entering the conversation. And here's where we get the real contradiction, I think, between self-interest and self-determination. Because after World War II, self-determination reemerged as the language of liberation movements and nations that wanted their independence. So the colonies that were breaking free from in Africa and Asia were beginning, to take their seats in a new global conversation table. This one was called the United Nations. And in the 1950s through the 1970s, the world was filled with these new nations with different bold experiments. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia sought to forge their own economic paths. Some wanted forms of socialism, some wanted mixed economies, some wanted trade policies that prioritized their own industries rather than foreign investments. But across the board, many sought to retain the wealth that was generated and embedded in their own land, ensuring that their mines, their rivers, and their resources would benefit them, not European or American multinational corporations. And this is where self-interest clashed violently with self-determination. Because, of course, it's not in the self-interest of the United States to allow an independent, self-sufficient Africa, for example, to emerge. It's not in the self-interest of the multinational corporations that relied on cheap labor and cheap resources to allow these countries to break free. A self-determined Congo, for example, super rich with minerals, would be a threat to Western supply chains. A self-determined Chile, with its vast copper reserves, would pose a danger to American business interests. A self-determined Iran, nationalizing its own oil, totally unacceptable. And so the United States did what self-interested empires have always done. They crushed self-determination or steered it where it threatened their dominance. And the United States itself built in an impossible roadblock at the United Nations with the Security Council to ensure a bit of this rigged game. So the CIA overthrew democratically elected leaders who pursued independent economic policies. Mossadegh in Iran, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Allende in Chile. and they installed military dictators and puppet regimes that ensured Western corporations could continue siphoning wealth from the global South. They assassinated leaders who spoke of unity, someone like Kwame Nkrumah, who envisioned a self-sufficient pan-African economic bloc, actually called the United States of Africa, was deposed in a Western-backed coup. The United States spent decades waging covert wars, funding counter-revolutionary forces, and propping up authoritarian regimes, all in the name of what they were saying was freedom, and sold to us as some kind of Cold War existential struggle against communism. And this is the central contradiction of neoliberalism. It claims to be about open markets and free choice, but in practice, it denies people the ability to choose anything that might disrupt existing power structures. The free market, we are told, must be protected, but only when it benefits the already powerful. When a nation tries to determine its own economic path outside of a Western-friendly style, it suddenly becomes an enemy, a rogue state, a dictatorship that must be corrected. And I know I mentioned there the United Nations, and in many conservative circles, there's an inherent skepticism of globalism and global government structures and all that. But I can assure you that the leftists share this same skepticism. The concentration of power on a global scale is a terrifying thing for both of us, which is precisely why so many of us are hoping for a more egalitarian global community which distills the power of the few strong countries and doesn't operate as a totalitarian global world police state, but rather something more like a global community meeting place with equal respect and valued input from all of its members. And of course, we, the leftists, like you, think that currently this global game is rigged. The self-interest of the few powerful and wealthy nations overrides the self-determination desires of the others. And here's the thing. Leftists have always understood this hypocrisy. We've always been skeptical of the smiling face of democracy promotion and humanitarian intervention. We've always known that institutions like USAID, which, by the way, Donald Trump said was filled with radical leftists, nothing can be further from the truth. We've always known that institutions like USAID, while offering surface-level goodwill, often serve the deeper function of keeping developing nations dependent on Western capital and scratching our backs when the time comes. We aren't sending condoms to Gaza, that was Gaza, Mozambique, by the way, out of pure goodwill. No, we're doing it to ensure that they remain economically entangled with us, reliant on our aid, maybe have a weaker form of government there while we do the job of it. And they're aligned generally with our interests if the time comes. It's charity in the same way that a billionaire philanthropist in your town might donate to a struggling institution, not purely out of kindness, but to maintain influence, secure loyalty, and dictate terms. It's less of an act of generosity than it is an investment in control. I think you Trumpers gesture at all of this when you talk about the deep state, but what you call the deep state, we leftists just call the more honest intentions of a hypocritical empire. Because this isn't a conspiracy that I've laid out, it's history. And if you want to know why so many nations are skeptical of American power, you don't have to look very far. They were really never given a choice. They were never allowed to self-determine in a way that wasn't first approved by American self-interest. And I think there are some obvious reasons why the world has drifted in this direction of the worship of markets and thinking even of morality in financial terms and in utilitarian terms. Because after the Second World War and the ability to do that to each other, I think we really kind of scared the shit out of ourselves. I think we began to not trust ourselves with this immense amount of power. And I think governments themselves also scared the hell out of themselves when they realized that we were so psychologically malleable as well. So we retreated into worshiping something we thought would be maybe a little less controversial as differing gods and cultures. We figured we could all chase material wealth and status and submit ourselves to the giant board game of market dynamics. And we all just sort of disappeared into being little marketeers. And you and I were born into a world which was building its structures upon those principles. And I think you, the Trumper, and me, the leftist, we know there are some serious problems with this picture. And you got tired of the bullshit. And so did we leftists. We have a lot in common in this regard. For decades, politicians from both parties came to your towns, shook your hands, and told you that things would get better. They promised new industries, new jobs, new investments, but those really never came. They said globalization was good for everyone, while your communities were hollowed out. They told you to learn to code, to move to the cities, to adapt to a world that didn't care about what you had built, what you valued, or what you lost. And politicians, by the way, didn't even bother coming to talk to us leftists because we were mostly stuck in the cities getting pushed out by high-rent liberals and tech bros whose votes were already locked up by the Democrats. We had no one to vote for either, while the New York Times endorsed candidates we didn't even want. You watched Wall Street get bailed out while your towns were left to rot. You saw factories shut down while CEOs cashed in stock options. You saw elites lecture you about progress while your version of progress was a declining life expectancy or stagnant at best, an opioid crisis, and boarded up main streets. And then there was Occupy Wall Street. Maybe you never set foot in Zuccotti Park, but you might remember the moment, and you might even remember feeling a little confused by it. I was there most days, observing and mildly participating. It was kind of a mess, but you were there too, in a way. On the surface, it seemed like just a bunch of college kids pitching tents and maybe shouting about socialism or something. But what was the moment really about? It was a reaction to the same thing that you were angry about. It was a response to the same elite class that had left you behind. Occupy Wall Street wasn't just about abstract economic theories. It was about the raw deal people got when the government bailed out banks and gave million-dollar golden parachutes to corporate executives and bank executives while they left working-class Americans to sink. And that was George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Barack Obama. Remember? The very same people who were just on the stage together a few months ago begging everyone to just stay the course and trust them a little longer and vote for their girl Kamala and not your guy. You surely remember that. I do. And we, and I'm really saying here, we as in leftists, share that anger, frustration, and resentment. And for some of us, it never really went away. It just found different expressions. And then Donald Trump came along, and he didn't give you the same song and dance. He didn't show up in your towns pretending to have some grand plan to bring back manufacturing or invest in clean energy. He didn't try to sell you a fairy tale. Well, he really does do some of that stuff, but it's not really the stuff you seem to go to the rallies for, right? I mean, no one goes to hear the specific plans or whatever. Democrats don't do that either. Everyone knows that there is no real plan other than the forces of global capitalism with, varying degrees of regulation and bumping a notch here or there. Don't let any Democrat tell you any different. The thing that you really were into when Trump when he would just say in his own way was that the game was rigged, that people running the country didn't care about you, and that he was going to wreck their party. And while that was appealing, I get why watching him drive the people who lied to you for years absolutely insane was kind of fun. We really just have to be careful here. Because Trump is tearing down a system that maybe deserves to be torn down to a degree. But what does he want to build in its place? Because if you're mad about being abandoned, about having your future sold off to the highest bidder, about having your culture mocked and erased, then I would be careful with being too excited about someone who seems to worship the very things or embody the very things that fed all of that in the first place. I mean, Trump isn't really looking to rebuild dignity, community, or fairness. He's looking to make the world into one giant casino, where everything is a transaction, where winning is the only morality, and where power is the only thing that seems to matter. Even if maybe it's based on a colorblind meritocracy, where we don't ever, seem to have time to debate or argue just what kind of skills or talents ought to be valued in the first place. And this is where you and I probably see things differently. But by now, I hope you might be thinking that, I am really not your enemy. And perhaps even you and I share the same one. But that doesn't mean that we're friends. So I want to tell you where we disagree. I want to tell you where I think Donald Trump, the man, who he really is and what he represents, because besides everything I've said about him maybe not being a neoliberal bullshitter and that being a bit refreshing for you and I think he's something else entirely. I think he's a nihilistic libertarian. And honestly, dear Trumpers out there, I don't think most of you are. I don't think you are as alike as Donald Trump the man as you think you might be. So, what's wrong with just taking Gaza and cherishing it, as he says, and turning it into some glamorous beachside resort? What's wrong with Trump's plan? You know, the one where he basically, when he's asked about if Palestinians would be able to return to Gaza, he basically says they won't want to. Presumably because he imagines they'll have some suburban paradise built for them somewhere else, I don't know, in Syria or Jordan or Egypt. You know, nice houses, clean sidewalks, maybe even a few golf courses, who knows? Trump would love that, right? I mean, who wouldn't? Now, I'll give it to him. We've all seen the pictures. Gaza is a demolition site. I mean, even someone like Norman Finkelstein has been saying this rather plainly and obviously for months. Israel has succeeded in making it unlivable. And for anyone who's been paying attention at all, they've always known that this was the Zionist plan. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu's face while Trump was delivering this plan was like all 8 days of Hanukkah rolled into one. I mean, it's literally in the charter of his party and has always been the intention of the Zionist colonial project since 1917 onward. You know, they haven't been shy about it, and I don't know how many times they have to tell us this plan in writing and actions and words for us to believe them. But here we are. It was always going to get to this moment. There was never any seriousness about the supposed two-state solution fantasy that Democrats or Republicans, maybe some Israelis, or even Palestinians in the media had been floating for decades. I mean, you've seen a map, right? The settlements weren't exactly slowing down in the West Bank. You aren't stupid. Neither is Trump in this regard. He knew this day was coming. He just said the quiet part out loud, and it was obvious. It was always going to be either this proposal or actually a courageous equality of coexistence in a newly imagined shared state with dignity and equal rights for all peoples there of any ethnicity or religion. Obviously, my preferred plan. But anyway, here's the thing. I think you understand what's wrong with the ethnic cleansing and, let's say, beautiful resettlement of Palestinians plan. Even if Donald John Trump himself really doesn't understand or even feel what's wrong with it. Let me put it to you this way. Imagine someone who maybe really hated Donald Trump and you, let's say the Clintons, the Clinton family or something, came and burned down Mar-a-Lago, just burned it to the ground, crushed it to rubble, destroyed it completely. And then, instead of apologizing, they said, "No sweat, Donald. We actually evaluated the place at $50 million before we flattened it. And we have a great offer for you. We're going to offer you a brand new home. And we built it up in the Colorado mountains, and it's really beautiful. It's just beautiful mountain views. We're constructing it now. It's worth $75 million. It has more bathrooms. It's more gold. It has better construction. What do you say, Donald?" I bet you Donald Trump wouldn't shed a single tear over Mar-a-Lago. He'd probably just try to negotiate the offer up to $80 million, sign the deal, call it a win, and brag about how the other guys are suckers and losers on social media. That's how he thinks, right? He measures everything in terms of deals and property value and increasing wealth. He is a perfect avatar of the aggressively neoliberal philosophy and mentality of our times. He extends this to all areas of life. But I don't think you think that way, even if you want to convince yourself you do. I mean, imagine if Obama came to a town in Iowa, somewhere that had been gutted by deindustrialization and globalization by both parties, where factories closed decades ago and moved overseas to countries where politicians were telling you, they were entering really good trade deals that would benefit you, and it didn't just quite happen that way. The jobs all dried up. And so Obama comes to this town and says, "Don't worry. We just built a brand new suburb outside of Silicon Valley, along with Mark Zuckerberg. You can all move there. We've got townhomes waiting for you, and you can take out some decent bank loans that we have, great terms, I promise, and learn how to code, and then join the tech industry, and everything's going to be great." How would that offer feel to you? I mean, some might take it. Some do basically live out that offer, and quote, vote with their feet. I mean, J.D. Vance himself wrote about this stuff fairly eloquently and emotionally back when he used to call Donald Trump Hitler. But some might find this offer and this speech from Obama humiliating and insulting. Some would mourn the loss of their community, their way of life, their history, maybe fear that their children would adopt different values out there in Silicon Valley. All of these things that, just can't be swapped out like furniture and moved in a U-Haul. So here's the deal. You Trumpers have pride. You've been disrespected by people who think they know what's best for you. And you don't like to beg. You don't want a handout. You sure as hell don't want the very same people who pulled the rug out from under your lives to now be the ones offering you a better one somewhere else, while they define what better means for you and scoff at your former definition. And so I think you understand why. When a Palestinian man hears Trump's offer, he scoffs and says, "You see this pile of rubble? It's more precious than any palace in America." He's not just being stubborn. He's not just being stupid. He knows that he'd rather have dignity, because you would rather work hard for even a modest life than be forced to take a more lavish and happy one by the very people defining for you what lavishness and happiness looks like, as they dismantled your autonomy to achieve your version of it. I mean, I'm basically echoing the timeless words of Patrick Henry here: give me liberty or give me death, right? Dignity, respect, responsibility, autonomy, freedom, that's the stuff that liberty is made of. And you get that. And so you're not like Donald Trump in that way. He would obviously take the deal. And I'm not even blaming him there. This is what the neoliberal market rationality assumes that people will do and what they ultimately want. But I think you know that that is a life without honor. And I think you deep down respect the dude sitting on the rubble more than the one who signs up for Trump's suburban offer. But I don't want to be, too presumptuous here. There's something to be said for a life at a prepaid country club, even if it was built by your oppressors. But I don't think that's you. So what I'm really saying here is that I think Trump is fun for you because he drives the bullshitters crazy. But I don't think you're as much like him as you might think. Trump believes that man can live by bread alone. But what I'm really talking about here is a word that I'm not sure how you feel about, since it's been slandered also a lot lately. I'm actually talking about justice. And I think this is where we actually also might agree. So the leftist position is actually quite simple, I think. It's this: no matter what you want to achieve that truly matters, in a deep sense, whether it's individually or collectively, a prerequisite for achieving it is a sufficiently satisfied sense of justice. And that's it, really. I'm trying to be careful with words here. This is the Leftist Theory of Man, which I think you can see is really at odds with the Neoliberal Theory of Man, which is all about transactional deals and getting ahead and gathering as much bread as possible. It's pure self-interest in that regard. The neoliberal rationality only sees justice when it happens to interfere and disrupt markets, which of course it often does in violent ways. And justice is a sense, it's a feeling. It can't be precisely measured, it can be inflated, manipulated, or even based on myths, but it could also be absolutely legitimate. And without a real effort to address this sense of justice, anything we build will collapse, either under its own moral hollowness or through violent outburst. And I think you Trumpers understand this. You have a sense of injustice. Sometimes based on things I would argue might be misinterpreted, but many things that are absolutely legitimate. And again, this is where leftists agree with you. The neoliberal global order is not just. It's not even trying to be just. And of course, Donald Trump is your vengeance and he's your retribution. But I think we need to be careful and think ahead. Because Trump and Elon Musk are taking a hatchet to a system that has been bullshitting you for a long time. And I understand why that's appealing, but be careful with what they want to install in its place, because it doesn't seem to align with what you were so angry about in the first place. The problem wasn't just that you got tired of the bullshit. Now that someone is saying what has always been true out loud, the conversation isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. Now that the bullshit's gone, do we want that world that we've always been driving towards? Should we bulldoze Gaza, remove the people, and build an Atlantic city on the Mediterranean? Trump sees no problem with that, but I think you do, because you know there's more to life than money, deals, and property value. That's the exact life liberals pursued out in Silicon Valley and the big coastal cities, which you, rightfully, scoff at as hollow and smug in its vision of flourishing. And Donald Trump and Elon Musk are not offering much of a different vision here, really. They might be interested in reducing the bloat in government and perhaps reducing the overextension of the military empire, though that very much remains to be seen. But they don't seem to be envisioning a world which would engage you in a real conversation about what makes life meaningful and what kind of world is worth pursuing. I mean, Trump and Elon are really a strange pair, aren't they? It's like, I remember a bumper sticker when I was a kid that was popular that said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." It seems that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are the human forms of this bumper sticker come to life. And when I was a kid, I would probably think if I saw the sticker that it would likely be on the car of a Republican. And the Democrats that I knew would feel that it was in bad taste. Though, to the careful observer, everybody seemed to be basically living out the sticker. That's what wars were really about. That's what business was really about. That's what dating was really about. That's what your job was really about. That's what which college that you got into was about. That's what whatever brand you happened to work for was really about. I mean, that bumper sticker basically could have been the official motto of the United States instead of that wistful phrase, "In God we trust," which, by the way, was adopted in 1956 to distinguish itself from the perceived threat of atheistic communism. And Trumpers, I know that's a nugget, the "In God we trust" thing of the American identity, which you really like. But just keep an eye on exactly who or what that God is. Because the richest man on earth and the man to whom nothing is sacred are partnered up at the moment. And it's getting difficult to distinguish that bumper sticker and anything else. And none of this makes Donald Trump your enemy, of course. I'm glad, though it's a bit dizzying and frightening, that he's just saying plainly what so many of us leftists were insisting was the real playbook of the world for so long, about so many things. But seeing that he, Donald Trump as a man, is not really like you, does mean that maybe, just maybe, you and I are not as far apart as you once thought. And now, thanks to your guy, we do have a little less bullshit to get through. We can discuss the kind of world worth pursuing in the 21st century. Will it be built upon that seed planted 100 years ago of the true pursuit of self-determination on national and individual levels? Or will it lean further into the nihilism of self-interest that I think Donald Trump represents? So now that the bullshit is gone, I think it's time that we talk.